February 19th, 1945. The first wave hit Iwo Jima's black beaches at precisely 0900 hours. Among the Marines clawing their way up those volcanic terraces was Corporal Tony Stein, carrying something that technically shouldn't exist, a weapon cobbled together from scavenged aircraft parts that violated approximately a dozen army regulations. A machine gun that fired so fast it didn't sound like a machine gun at all, but like fabric being torn apart by invisible hands. When Stein stood upright in that killing field, deliberately drawing Japanese fire while his platoon scrambled for cover, he was betting his life on a weapon built by a sergeant who'd learned engineering not in any classroom, but in a Minnesota machine shop during the Depression. The stinger in Stein's hands represented something the military bureaucracy never intended, a solution born not from procurement committees or engineering departments, but from necessity, innovation, and the kind of practical genius that emerges when regulations become obstacles to survival. What nobody knew that morning was that this unauthorized weapon, this Frankenstein machine gun assembled in Hawaiian workshops from components that were never meant to fit together. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Would help earn Stein the Medal of Honor. And what even fewer knew was that the story didn't start on Iwo Jima at all. It started 14 months earlier on a different volcanic island, where a different Marine watched men die because the weapons they'd been issued simply weren't good enough. The problem was written in blood across every Pacific island where Marines fought and died waiting for fire support that arrived seconds too late. The M1919, a 6 Browning machine gun, was reliable, proven, and completely inadequate for the kind of warfare Marines faced in the Pacific. 32 pounds of steel that required multiple men to move effectively. A rate of fire around 400 to 550 rounds per minute that provided suppression, sure, but not the overwhelming firepower needed to silence Japanese pillboxes before they cut down advancing Marines. By late 1943, Marine rifle companies had learned to accept a brutal calculation. When you assaulted a fortified position, some percentage of your men would die in the approach because your machine guns couldn't deliver enough fire to keep defenders' heads down. This wasn't a secret. Every company commander knew it. Every machine gunner felt it. But knowing and fixing are different things, and fixing required equipment the Marine Corps hadn't issued. Sergeant Milan Grevich understood this problem with the clarity that comes from watching friends die. Born in Mountain Iron, Minnesota, on May 24, 1924, he'd grown up in Depression-era iron country, where you learned to fix things because replacement wasn't an option. His father worked the mines. The family struggled. Young Mel learned that machinery broke, and you either repaired it yourself or did without. That practical education, the kind that teaches you to see systems not as they're designed but as they actually function under stress, would prove more valuable than any military training manual. When Grevich enlisted in the Marine Corps, he brought with him not just physical courage, but mechanical intuition, the ability to look at equipment and understand not what the manual said it could do, but what it actually could do if you were willing to deviate from the blueprint. The Marine parachute battalions attracted men like Grevich, Marines who wanted harder challenges, who sought the most demanding training, who believed elite units required elite thinking. The Paramarines were an experiment that never quite succeeded as intended. They trained for airborne operations that never materialized in the Pacific theater. But that training created something valuable anyway, a culture of innovation and aggressive problem-solving that spread through the Fleet Marine Force when the parachute battalions disbanded. November 1st, 1943. Bougainville, Empress Augusta Bay. Grevich and the 3rd Parachute Battalion hit the beach as part of the invasion force. The operation was successful by official metrics, securing beachheads and establishing positions inland. But Grevich saw something during that campaign that wouldn't leave him alone, a weapon that shouldn't have been there, an aircraft machine gun someone had jerry-rigged for ground use. Private William Colby had salvaged an ANM-2 from a crashed aircraft, added a crude bipod, and kept the original spade grips. When Japanese forces attacked on November 3rd, Colby's improvised weapon fired at a rate that seemed impossible. The sound was wrong, faster than any ground-based machine gun, a continuous roar rather than the familiar rhythmic hammering of the Browning. The psychological effect was immediate. Japanese attackers who'd learned to time their movements between Browning bursts found themselves facing fire that left no gaps for movement. Colby's weapon, crude as it was, created a wall of suppression that standard machine guns couldn't match. Grevich watched this and saw not just a field expedient, but proof of concept. If this barely modified aircraft gun could produce such devastating results, what might be possible with proper conversion? Together with Private First Class John Little, Grevich began work on what would become the first true Stinger. They started with another AN-M2 brought ashore at Empress Augusta Bay. The spade grips designed for aircraft gunners were useless for infantry. Grevich fabricated a trigger mechanism from sheet metal, crude but functional. For a stock, they modified an M1 Garand buttstock, carefully hollowing it to accept the aircraft gun's unique buffer tube configuration. From a Browning automatic rifle, they took the bipod and rear sight. These components offered multiple advantages. Every Marine already knew the BAR, was already familiar with its sight picture and bipod deployment. Using these parts meant the Stinger would feel familiar despite its revolutionary performance. The result was a weapon unlike anything in the Marine Corps arsenal. 40 inches long, 25 pounds, fully configured, belt-fed with 100-round capacity. It looked cobbled together because it was an amalgamation of 3 different weapon systems held together by ingenuity and necessity. But when Grevich test-fired it, the performance exceeded even optimistic expectations. The cyclic rate remained close to the aircraft specification, between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute, 3 times faster than the M1919A6. That Stinger never saw combat on Bougainville. The fighting concluded before they could test it in battle, but the weapon represented validation that aircraft machine guns could be successfully converted for infantry use with dramatic improvements in firepower. When the Marine Parachute Battalions disbanded on February 29, 1944, Grevich found himself reassigned to G Company, 28th Marine Regiment, 5th Marine Division. The Paramarines scattered across the Fleet Marine Force, their expertise distributed among conventional units. This disbandment, while disappointing to the elite troops who'd trained so hard, actually served to spread the Paramarine culture throughout the Corps. Innovation, aggression, and willingness to challenge conventional approaches weren't confined to one battalion anymore. They became infectious. The 5th Marine Division activated on January 21, 1944, at Camp Pendleton. Built around cadres from the disbanded parachute battalions, it inherited not just personnel but culture. The division included the 26th, 27th, and 28th Marine Regiments, with the 28th receiving a disproportionate number of former Paramarines. From inception, the division was slated for a major amphibious assault, though the specific target remained classified. Throughout 1944, as the division trained at Camp Pendleton and later in Hawaii, rumors circulated. Some speculated Formosa. Others believed the Philippines or the China coast. The truth, revealed in classified briefings in late 1944, proved more daunting than any rumor. The 5th Marine Division was bound for Iwo Jima, a volcanic speck that intelligence estimated would require 1 week to secure. When Grevich joined G Company in November 1944, the regiment was deep in training for Operation Detachment. The training was intense, focusing on assaulting heavily fortified positions across difficult terrain. Mock beaches simulated volcanic sand. Live fire exercises tested coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. During these exercises, Grevich quickly grew frustrated. The problem he'd observed on Bougainville hadn't been solved. The Marine Corps had fielded no new weapons addressing the fundamental limitations of the M1919A6. Marines were training with the same equipment, facing the same tactical constraints, accepting the same casualties that better equipment might prevent. Grevich watched machine gun crews struggle to keep pace with advancing rifle platoons. He watched suppressive fire arrive too late to save Marines caught in killing zones. He saw demolition teams pinned down because machine guns couldn't deliver sufficient fire to suppress mock defensive positions. He knew a better solution existed because he'd helped build it a year earlier. The memory of that first stinger gnawed at him. He'd seen what the weapon could do in testing. He'd watched Colby's crude modification devastate a Japanese attack. He knew that properly engineered stingers could give Marine rifle companies the firepower advantage they desperately needed. Grevich approached his company commander with a proposal. He could build modified aircraft machine guns that would give each platoon unprecedented firepower. The company commander understood this was unauthorized modification of government property, potential grounds for court-martial, but he also understood his Marines were training for an assault that would require every possible advantage. The request passed up to the battalion commander. Remarkably, perhaps reflecting the para-marine culture that permeated the 28th Marines, the battalion commander approved. This approval came with an important caveat. The modifications weren't officially sanctioned by Marine Corps headquarters, wouldn't appear on property records, would exist in the grey area between field modification and unauthorized equipment. But they were authorized at battalion level, a crucial distinction that protected Grevich from charges of unauthorized modification. The battalion commander put his approval in writing, creating a paper trail that legitimized the project within the battalion's sphere of authority. This distinction might seem like bureaucratic hair-splitting, but it reflected sophisticated understanding of military authority and responsibility. The battalion commander was betting his career on Grevich's ability to deliver effective weapons. Grevich set to work in Hawaii with John Little. They scoured the island for crashed or damaged aircraft, for spare parts from planes being cannibalized, for any source of AN-M2 machine guns. Hawaii, as a major staging area for Pacific operations, hosted numerous airbases where damaged aircraft were evaluated for repair or salvage. The two Marines developed relationships with Navy and Marine aviation personnel, explaining their project, requesting access to surplus weapons. Some aviation units were skeptical, questioning why ground troops wanted aircraft guns. Others were supportive, understanding that innovation saving Marine lives deserved support regardless of regulations. The construction process was meticulous, despite crude workshops. Each stinger required precise cutting of M1 Garand stocks, careful fabrication of trigger mechanisms, exact fitting of BAR bipods and sights. The work couldn't be rushed. A poorly fitted stock might crack under recoil. An improperly fabricated trigger might fail at critical moments. Sights had to be precisely aligned to ensure accuracy. The trigger mechanism presented the greatest technical challenge. Aircraft machine guns used solenoid triggers activated by electrical switches, perfect for synchronized fire through propeller arcs but useless for infantry work. Grevich designed a simple mechanical trigger that could be fabricated from sheet metal and operated by finger pressure. The mechanism needed strength to withstand repeated use and rough handling, but light enough that a gunner could maintain trigger control during sustained fire. The design went through several iterations before Grevich achieved proper balance. Early versions were too stiff, requiring excessive pressure that made precise fire control difficult. Later versions were too light, creating risk of accidental discharge. The final design used carefully calculated spring tension, providing positive trigger feel without excessive pressure. The stock presented its own challenges. The M1 Garand stock was solid walnut, designed to withstand considerable recoil. The wood's density and grain structure provided excellent strength but made it difficult to work with hand tools. To fit the AN-M2's unique receiver and buffer tube configuration, Grevich had to carefully hollow out the stock, removing wood while maintaining structural integrity. Too much material removed would weaken the stock, potentially causing catastrophic failure during firing. Too little material removed would prevent proper fit. Grevich worked slowly, carefully, using chisels and files to remove wood incrementally, test-fitting the receiver repeatedly to ensure proper alignment. The process for each stock took several days of patient work. The bipod and sight from the Browning automatic rifle required adapter fabrication, Mounting points on BAR components didn't align with the ANM2's configuration, necessitating custom-made brackets. These brackets had to maintain zero under firing stress, but remain light enough not to significantly increase overall weight. Grevich fabricated brackets from steel plate, drilling and tapping mounting holes, bending metal to achieve proper angles, welding reinforcement where stress analysis indicated potential failure points. Each bracket was test-fitted, adjusted, refitted until the bipod and sight mounted solidly with no play or movement. The work was painstaking, each stinger representing dozens of hours of skilled labor, but Grevich understood lives would depend on these weapons. A malfunction in combat meant not just a failed weapon but potentially dead Marines. Every weld had to be sound, every fit had to be precise, every component had to be tested and verified. By January 1945, as the 5th Marine Division prepared to board ships for the journey to Iwo Jima, Grevich had completed 6 stingers. Each weapon had been test-fired extensively, adjusted and refined until it functioned reliably. Testing revealed the fundamental limitation that would constrain stinger employment in combat. The overheating problem inherent in the thin aircraft barrel couldn't be eliminated. Without aircraft slipstream cooling, the barrel would grow dangerously hot after sustained fire. Extended firing could warp or even melt the barrel, rendering the weapon useless. Grevich trained his gunners in strict fire discipline. Short bursts only, 3 to 5 seconds maximum, allowing the barrel to cool between engagements. This discipline was absolutely critical. An overheated stinger was worse than no stinger, representing wasted weight and a gunner who could have carried a conventional weapon. The 6 guns represented countless hours of work, materials acquired through unofficial channels, modifications existing in a grey area between innovation and regulation. But they were exactly what the 28th Marines needed for Iwo Jima. The weapons offered firepower no other rifle company in the division could match. Distribution of the 6 stingers was carefully considered. 1 went to each of G Company's 3 rifle platoons, providing each with organic firepower exceeding authorized weapons. Platoon commanders received special briefings on employment tactics, learning to maximize stinger capabilities while managing limitations. 1 gun went to the company's demolitions section, where it would provide covering fire for engineers attacking fortified positions. Grevich kept the 5th gun, taking personal responsibility for employing the weapon he'd created. The 6th stinger went to a Marine from a company, 28th Marines. His name was Tony Stein, and his actions with this weapon would help him earn the nation's highest decoration for valor. Tony Stein was born September 30th, 1921, in Dayton, Ohio, to immigrant parents from Austria-Hungary. His parents came to America seeking opportunity and freedom from political instability. They settled in Dayton, part of the Eastern European immigration wave that transformed American industrial cities in the early 20th century. The Stein family struggled financially, particularly during the Great Depression. When economic hardship forced difficult choices, Tony dropped out of high school during freshman year. This wasn't uncommon during the Depression, when family survival often required every able-bodied person to work. Education was a luxury many families simply couldn't afford. Tony found work where he could, eventually securing an apprenticeship as a toolmaker. This training proved far more valuable than any academic education he might have received. Toolmaking in the 1930s required understanding precision measurement, material properties, machine operation, and manufacturing processes. A skilled toolmaker needed to read technical drawings, calculate tolerances, operate lathes and milling machines, and create precisely fabricated components. The work demanded patience, attention to detail, and problem-solving ability. Toolmakers created the specialized tools and dies used in mass production, meaning their work had to be absolutely precise. An error of a few thousandths of an inch could render an entire production run unusable. This training gave Stein hands-on experience with metal fabrication remarkably similar to what would be required to modify aircraft machine guns. He understood stress points and material tolerances. He knew how to fabricate custom components. He had practical knowledge to look at equipment and understand how it could be modified or improved. When war came, Stein didn't wait for the draft. On September 22, 1942, shortly before his 21st birthday, he enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve. The timing was significant. By September 1942, America had been at war nearly 10 months. The initial wave of patriotic volunteers had already enlisted. The reality of war's cost was becoming clear through casualty reports from Guadalcanal and other early Pacific battles. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Stein knew what he was volunteering for. The Marines had a reputation for getting the hardest assignments, for going in first, for suffering the highest casualties. He wanted to defend his country where the fighting was fiercest. This decision revealed core aspects of his character: willingness to face danger, a sense of duty transcending personal safety, belief that his country's defense required his service regardless of risk. Stein's recruit training at Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego marked him as exceptional. The training was deliberately brutal, designed to break down civilian habits and build Marine discipline. Physical conditioning pushed recruits to their limits. Marksmanship training demanded precision. Close order drill instilled instant obedience to commands. Some recruits barely survived. Others excelled, demonstrating physical toughness, mental resilience, and leadership potential that marked them for elite assignments. Stein impressed his drill instructors sufficiently to be selected for Marine parachute training at Camp Gillespie. Paramarine selection was an honor, but also meant volunteering for even more demanding training. Parachute school had a high washout rate. Physical requirements were extreme, training dangerous, discipline stricter than conventional Marine units. Those completing the course joined an elite brotherhood characterized by exceptional esprit de corps. Though the Paramarines never jumped into combat, their training created Marines of unusual capability and initiative. The curriculum emphasized independent thinking, small unit tactics, and adaptability. Paramarines were expected to operate behind enemy lines with minimal support, requiring soldiers who could think for themselves and solve problems without detailed orders. When the parachute battalions disbanded, Stein was promoted to corporal and assigned to the 5th Marine Division, serving as assistant squad leader of A Company, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines. His toolmaker skills made him invaluable for weapons maintenance and modification. In any infantry unit, weapons need adjustment, sights need alignment, magazines need tuning. When word spread through the 28th Marines about Grevich's Stinger project, Stein's skills and interest made him a natural collaborator. The exact nature of his involvement remains unclear in historical records. Some sources suggest he assisted with fabrication of multiple Stingers. Others indicate he primarily worked on modifying his own weapon. What's certain is that Stein ended up with the 6th Stinger, the weapon that would help him earn the Medal of Honor. The relationship between Stein and his Stinger represented more than simply a soldier being issued a weapon. Stein understood the weapon intimately because he'd helped create it. He knew its capabilities and limitations, knew exactly how hard he could push it before overheating became critical, knew the precise sight picture required for accurate fire. This intimate knowledge would prove crucial during desperate fighting on Iwo Jima, where Stein would employ the Stinger with tactical sophistication, maximizing its unique capabilities. The journey to Iwo Jima began in January 1945 as the 5th Marine Division, along with the 3rd and 4th Marine Divisions, boarded transport ships in Hawaii. Approximately 70,000 Marines and attached Navy personnel crowded onto transports that would carry them 2,000 miles west across the Pacific. The men knew their destination by now. Security restrictions had relaxed enough to allow detailed briefings. Marines studied aerial photographs of Iwo Jima, a pork chop-shaped island dominated by Mount Suribachi on its southern tip. The island measured roughly 5 miles long and 2.5 miles at its widest point, comprising approximately 8 square miles of volcanic rock and ash. Intelligence officers explained the island's strategic importance using maps and charts. Iwo Jima sat roughly 750 miles south of Tokyo, positioned between the newly captured Marianas and the Japanese home islands. In American hands, the island's airfields could serve multiple critical functions. B-29 Superfortress bombers flying from the Marianas to Japan operated at the extreme edge of their range. Any damage sustained over the target meant potentially ditching in the ocean during the long flight home. Iwo Jima would provide an emergency landing strip where damaged bombers could land for repairs rather than attempting the full return flight. The island could also base fighter escorts for the bombers. The P-51 Mustang had sufficient range to accompany B-29s to Japan and back if it could refuel at Iwo Jima. Fighter escort would dramatically improve bomber survival rates against Japanese air defenses. Finally, Iwo Jima would serve as a launching point for the eventual invasion of Japan itself, providing advanced bases for air support, logistics, and command facilities. But what intelligence officers couldn't fully convey was the sophistication of Japanese defenses. Intelligence estimates based on aerial reconnaissance and submarine observations significantly underestimated both garrison strength and fortification extent. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, assigned to defend Iwo Jima in June 1944, had 9 months to prepare. A career officer with extensive combat experience in China and strategic studies at Army War College, Kuribayashi understood both tactical situation and strategic reality facing Japan. He recognized that Japan had already lost the war. American industrial production, military strength, and technological superiority made Japanese defeat inevitable. But the timing and terms of that defeat remained in question. If Japan could make invasion costs sufficiently horrific, if American casualties mounted high enough, political pressure might force negotiation rather than unconditional surrender. Kuribayashi's mission wasn't victory but delay. Not to defend Iwo Jima successfully, but to make the Americans pay such terrible price that they might reconsider invading the Japanese home islands. He approached this mission with cold calculation and innovative defensive doctrine. Traditional Japanese defensive strategy called for fighting at the water's edge, meeting invaders on beaches, destroying them before they could establish a foothold. This approach had achieved some success in earlier campaigns, but proven increasingly ineffective against American amphibious capability. Naval, gunfire and air support could devastate beach defenses. American armor could break through positions that stopped infantry. Kuribayashi abandoned this traditional approach entirely. He ordered his 21,000 troops to dig in, to burrow into Iwo Jima's volcanic rock, to create an underground fortress that could withstand even the heaviest bombardment. His men excavated 18 kilometers of tunnels, creating an interconnected network of fighting positions, supply depots, and command posts. They constructed hundreds of concealed pillboxes using reinforced concrete and volcanic rock. These positions were masterfully camouflaged, invisible from the air and nearly invisible from ground level, until Marines were almost on top of them. Each position was sited to provide interlocking fields of fire, ensuring attackers who neutralized one position would immediately be engaged by others. Artillery and mortar positions were constructed in caves and covered bunkers, allowing Japanese gunners to fire on pre-arranged targets, then retreat into cover before counter-battery fire could respond. Pre-registered firing points covered every likely avenue of approach, every beach, every terrain feature attacking forces might use for cover. Kuribayashi trained his men in new defensive doctrine that rejected the banzai charges and suicidal attacks characterizing earlier Japanese resistance. There would be no wasteful gestures of honor, no dramatic but tactically meaningless attacks. Every man would fight from cover, fire only when targets presented themselves, inflict maximum casualties while preserving their own lives as long as possible. Each defender was instructed to kill 10 Americans before dying himself. Positions would be defended to the last man, but defenders wouldn't throw away lives in useless attacks. They would make Americans dig them out one position at a time, paying in blood for every yard of volcanic rock. The discipline required to implement this doctrine was extraordinary. Traditional Japanese military culture emphasized aggressive offensive action, glorious death in battle, honor through sacrifice. Kuribayashi was asking his men to abandon these deeply ingrained values, to accept they would all die, but to die in ways maximizing enemy casualties rather than personal glory. That he succeeded in imposing this discipline speaks to both his leadership ability and desperate circumstances Japan faced by early 1945. The men defending Iwo Jima understood they were doomed, that no reinforcement would come, that the best they could hope for was to die serving Japan's final defense. The pre-invasion bombardment began February 16, 1945. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the Marine Forces, had requested 10 days of naval bombardment based on intelligence estimates of Japanese defensive strength. He understood from bitter experience that reducing fortified positions required sustained fire over days, not hours. The Navy provided 3 days. This decision reflected both strategic demands of the broader Pacific campaign and fundamental misunderstanding of defensive preparations on Iwo Jima. Naval planners believed 3 days of concentrated fire from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers would suffice to neutralize defensive positions and suppress remaining resistance. For 72 hours, the most powerful naval task force ever assembled pounded Iwo Jima. Battleships firing 16-inch guns hurled shells weighing more than a ton into volcanic rock. Cruisers added 8-inch fire. Destroyers maneuvered close inshore to engage specific targets with 5-inch guns. The bombardment was staggering in scale. Thousands of shells crashed into the island every hour. Entire sections of terrain disappeared under explosions. Volcanic rock shattered and sprayed across the landscape. From transport ships where Marines waited, the island seemed to be disintegrating under the weight of fire. 29 bombers flew strikes from the Marianas, adding heavy bombs to naval gunfire. Navy aircraft from fast carriers attacked systematically, bombing and strafing any visible targets. The combined firepower represented the most concentrated bombardment yet delivered against a Pacific island. Marines watching from transports felt confident. Nothing could survive that bombardment. Intelligence estimates predicted 1 week to secure the island. A few officers privately speculated they might wrap up operations in 3 or 4 days. They were catastrophically wrong. The bombardment, while visually impressive, was largely ineffective against Kuribayashi's underground fortress. Naval shells designed to penetrate ship armor or destroy surface structures had limited effect on positions dug deep into volcanic rock. Bombs created impressive craters but failed to collapse tunnel networks beneath. The Japanese, following Kuribayashi's orders, remained in underground positions throughout bombardment. They didn't return fire, didn't reveal positions, didn't give American gunners any targets to engage. The Americans were in many cases bombarding empty terrain, while actual defensive positions remained untouched deep underground. When bombardment lifted on the morning of February 19th, Kuribayashi's forces emerged from tunnels largely intact, weapons functional, ammunition stocks undiminished, defensive positions still viable. 3 days of bombardment had accomplished little beyond alerting defenders that invasion was imminent. February 19th, 1945, dawned clear and cold. Hour was set for 0900. The 1st Assault Wave, 5th Marine Division on the left, 4th Marine Division on the right, would land across 700 yards of beach designated Green Beach, Red Beach, Yellow Beach, and Blue Beach from south to north. As the Amtraks churned toward shore carrying their loads of Marines, the men could see Mount Suribachi looming ahead, a dormant volcano 554 feet high dominating the southern end of the island. Naval gunfire shifted inland as the first wave approached the beach, and an eerie silence fell over Iwo Jima. The Marines hit the beach at precisely 0900 and immediately encountered their first obstacle. The beach wasn't sand in the traditional sense, but volcanic ash, black and loose, rising in terraces 15 feet high. Men sank to their ankles with every step. Some sank to their knees. The volcanic ash provided no stable footing, no firm surface for digging in or establishing firing positions. Vehicles bogged down immediately. Tanks and Amtraks attempting to climb beach terraces found their treads spinning uselessly in loose ash. Equipment supposed to move inland to support advancing infantry became stuck within yards of the waterline. Marines clawed their way forward, expecting Japanese fire at any moment. The silence continued, broken only by sound of naval gunfire falling inland and laboured breathing of men struggling through volcanic ash. Officers checked watches nervously. The lack of resistance felt wrong. Ominous. For nearly an hour the Japanese held their fire, following Kuribayashi's orders to the letter. Let the Americans land. Let them crowd onto the beach. Let them struggle forward, bringing more and more men into the killing zone. Wait until maximum number of targets present themselves. Wait until the beach is packed with men and equipment. Wait until a single command can unleash hell. At approximately 10:00, when the beach was crowded with men and vehicles, when Marines were struggling through ash, unable to advance quickly or take effective cover, when thousands of Americans were packed into confined space between waterline and first terrace, the entire island erupted. Artillery and mortar fire fell in devastating concentrations, pre-registered fires that had been plotted weeks in advance. High explosive shells burst among packed Marines, sending fragments tearing through flesh and equipment. Mortar rounds dropped into volcanic ash, with dull crunches before exploding. Machine guns fired from hidden positions in the terraces, from concealed pillboxes, from firing ports so skillfully camouflaged that Marines couldn't locate them even while taking fire. The interlocking fields of fire Kuribayashi had so carefully planned meant attackers seeking cover from one position immediately exposed themselves to fire from another. Marines died in the black volcanic sand, cut down by fire they couldn't see, from positions they couldn't locate, delivered by an enemy that remained invisible. The pre-invasion bombardment, supposed to have neutralized defensive positions, had barely scratched Kuribayashi's defenses. Men tried to dig in, but loose volcanic ash collapsed faster than they could excavate. Wounded Marines sank into the ash, sometimes disappearing entirely. Corpsmen trying to treat casualties became casualties themselves. Officers attempting to organize advances were cut down by machine gun fire. The 28th Marines, landing on the extreme left of the assault beaches, had orders to drive south and isolate Mount Suribachi. This mission put them directly under fire from the volcano's slopes, where Kuribayashi had positioned some of his strongest defenses. Tony Stein was the first man from his unit to move inland after hitting the beach. While others sought cover or struggled with equipment in chaotic moments after landing, Stein advanced carrying his Stinger. The weapon's 25-pound weight, light for a machine gun, allowed him to move quickly despite treacherous terrain. As the rest of his platoon attempted to establish a foothold, Stein provided covering fire with the Stinger. The weapon's incredible rate of fire shocked both sides. Japanese defenders who'd faced Browning machine guns throughout the Pacific War suddenly encountered something entirely different. A continuous roar that poured rounds, at unprecedented rates. The sound was distinctive and terrifying. Where the Browning created rhythmic hammering, the Stinger produced a tearing roar, like canvas being ripped apart at enormous speed. The volume of fire was so high it created visible traces streaming toward targets, looking almost like a solid line of fire. When Stein's comrades became pinned down by concentrated machine gun and mortar fire, he made a decision defying every survival instinct. He stood upright, completely exposed, deliberately drawing Japanese fire to himself. This wasn't reckless bravado but tactical calculation, born from training and combat instinct. By exposing himself, Stein forced the Japanese to reveal positions by firing at him. The muzzle flashes, the puffs of dust kicked up by firing, the slight movement of camouflage being disturbed, all these things became visible when the Japanese engaged such a prominent target. Once he located hostile guns, Stein could engage them with the Stinger. The weapon proved devastatingly effective against pillboxes. Its high rate of fire allowed Stein to pour enough rounds into firing ports to suppress or eliminate defenders inside. A 3-second burst sent 75 rounds into a space perhaps 18 inches square, a concentration of fire giving defenders no opportunity to return fire effectively. Stein charged Japanese pillboxes one by one, firing the Stinger from the hip in short, controlled bursts. The technique required tremendous upper body strength and weapon control. The Stinger, despite relatively light weight, generated significant recoil when firing at 1,200 rounds per minute. Maintaining aim while advancing required strength, skill, and absolute focus. The Stinger consumed ammunition at alarming rates. Despite Stein's discipline in using short bursts rather than sustained fire, he rapidly exhausted his supply. The weapon's primary limitation, its prodigious appetite for ammunition, became critical in sustained combat. When the Stinger ran dry, Stein made a decision combining courage with practical necessity. He kicked off his shoes and threw down his helmet, items that would slow him down, and ran back to the beach to retrieve ammunition. The decision to remove shoes and helmet seems almost incomprehensible. These items provided protection and support. But Stein understood speed mattered more than protection during the 400-yard dash back to the beach. The volcanic ash was treacherous for running even in bare feet, nearly impossible in boots that would sink and catch with every step. The 400 yards back to the beach took him across open ground, swept by Japanese fire. Artillery and mortar rounds were still falling on the beach. Machine guns covered the approaches. Snipers looked for targets of opportunity, but Stein ran the gauntlet, reached the beach, grabbed ammunition, and ran back to his position. He made this run 8 times during that first day. 8 times he sprinted through hell. 8 times he returned carrying the 100-round ammunition boxes, keeping the Stinger firing. And every single time he made the return trip, he carried or assisted a wounded Marine back with him. This detail, specifically mentioned in his Medal of Honor citation, reveals Stein's character as clearly as any combat action. He could have made ammunition runs faster if he ran alone. He could have maximized his own survival chances by minimizing time spent exposed. But on every return trip, he looked for wounded Marines who needed evacuation, and he helped get them to the beach where corpsmen could treat them. During these frantic hours of combat, Stein personally killed at least 20 Japanese defenders. This number, documented in his Medal of Honor citation, represents confirmed kills observed by other Marines. The actual number was likely higher, as many enemy casualties occurred inside pillboxes, where observers couldn't verify results. He destroyed multiple pillboxes that had pinned down his platoon, allowing other Marines to advance. Each pillbox neutralized represented lives saved, wounds prevented, tactical objectives achieved. The Stinger was shot out of Stein's hands twice by Japanese fire. The weapon was struck by bullets that should have killed Stein, but instead damaged only the gun. Both times he retrieved ammunition, performed field repairs if possible, or grabbed another weapon and continued fighting. By nightfall on February 19th, the Marines had established a precarious toehold on Iwo Jima. They'd advanced perhaps 300 to 500 yards inland across a front several thousand yards wide. The 28th Marines had reached the base of Mount Suribachi, but hadn't yet begun the climb. The cost had been horrific. More than 2,400 Marines were killed or wounded on D-Day alone, the highest single-day casualty rate of any amphibious assault in the Pacific War. The optimistic predictions of a 1-week campaign were already revealed as fantasy. That night, Marines dug in as best they could in volcanic ash, knowing Japanese infiltrators and counterattacks would probe their lines throughout hours of darkness. The wounded were evacuated to ships offshore when possible, though many remained on the beach throughout the night waiting for transport. Tony Stein cleaned the Stinger, checked its function, and prepared for the next day's fighting. The weapon had performed magnificently, beyond even the optimistic expectations of its creators. But the battle had barely begun. The fighting for Iwo Jima would continue for 36 more days, each bringing fresh horrors as Marines fought to clear the island foot by bloody foot. The battle evolved into brutal contest of attrition, with Marines attacking fortified positions that had to be destroyed one at a time. The 28th Marines drove south toward Mount Suribachi, while other regiments pushed north and east across the island. The volcano's lower slopes were honeycombed with defensive positions, each covering approaches to others, creating a defensive network that defied simple tactics. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads worked in coordination with machine guns and rifles. The standard technique involved suppressing a position with rifle and machine gun fire, while demolition teams maneuvered close enough to destroy it with satchel charges or flamethrowers. But even destroyed positions might be reoccupied overnight as Japanese troops moved through tunnel networks. The Stingers proved invaluable in this fighting. Their concentrated firepower allowed Marines to suppress pillboxes long enough for demolition teams to approach and destroy them. The weapon's high rate of fire created the kind of overwhelming suppression that gave attackers those crucial seconds needed to close with enemy positions. On February 23rd, just 4 days into the fighting, a patrol from the 28th Marines climbed Mount Suribachi and raised a small American flag on the summit. The flag raising, visible from across the island and from ships offshore, provided tremendous morale boost to Marines still fighting in the volcanic wasteland below. Hours later, a larger flag was raised by a different group of Marines. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, positioned to photograph what he thought would be routine flag replacement, captured that second raising in what would become the most famous photograph of World War II. The iconic image showed 6 Marines struggling to raise the flagpole against wind on Suribachi's summit, a moment of triumph and determination that came to symbolize American resolve and sacrifice. But the photograph also created a misleading impression that the battle was nearly over. In reality, the hardest fighting still lay ahead. Tony Stein witnessed the flag raising from below. Mount Suribachi's capture represented significant tactical victory, securing the southern portion of the island and eliminating defensive positions that had poured fire onto beaches since D-Day, but victory had come at terrible cost. Stein himself had been wounded during fighting on Suribachi's slopes, injuries serious enough that he was evacuated to a hospital ship for treatment. The exact nature of his wounds isn't detailed in historical records, but they were sufficient to warrant evacuation from front lines. Aboard ship recovering from his wounds, Stein learned his company was heavily engaged in vicious fighting for a position designated Hill 362A on the northern part of the island. A company had suffered heavy casualties. The fighting was desperate, and every Marine was needed. Despite his injuries, despite being legitimately evacuated and under medical care, Stein left the hospital ship and returned to his unit. He couldn't remain safe while his Marines fought and died on Hill 362A. This decision was characteristic of the bond between Marines, the sense of brotherhood that transcended personal safety. Stein's squad was fighting without him. His absence meant someone else had to carry the stinger. Someone else had to provide that crucial suppressive fire. Someone else was exposed to dangers he could face in their place. On March 1, 1945, 10 days after his Medal of Honor actions, Tony Stein volunteered to lead a 19-man patrol to reconnoiter Japanese positions that had a company pinned down. The patrol's mission was to identify enemy machine gun emplacements so the company could coordinate attacks to neutralize them. Stein carried his stinger, the weapon that had become his signature, the tool he understood better than anyone. The patrol moved forward carefully, using what cover the volcanic terrain provided, watching for the nearly invisible firing ports that marked Japanese defensive positions. Stein located one pillbox and engaged it with the stinger, pouring suppressive fire into the position. The familiar tearing roar of the weapon echoed across volcanic rock, the sound that had become a symbol of hope to Marines and terror to Japanese defenders. But as Stein concentrated on that target, fire from another concealed position found him. The Japanese defensive network was designed specifically to create these situations where attacking one position exposed the attacker to fire from another. A Japanese sniper positioned in a carefully camouflaged hide acquired Stein in his sights and fired a single shot. The round struck true, and Tony Stein, 24 years old, fell dead in the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima. His body was initially buried in the 5th Marine Division Cemetery on the island, grave number 11-07, plot 5, row 6. He joined thousands of other Marines who would be temporarily interred on Iwo Jima before being returned home after the war. The patrol recovered his body and his stinger, the weapon, marked by the combat it had seen, the modifications that made it unique, was eventually lost to history. Like the other 5 stingers, the Marine Corps, institutionally averse to non-standard equipment, likely destroyed them after the battle. Grevich and the other Stinger gunners continued fighting throughout the remaining weeks of battle. The 28th Marines participated in some of the war's most vicious combat, attacking fortified positions across terrain that offered minimal cover and against defenders who fought with suicidal determination. The The battle officially ended March 26, 1945, though isolated pockets of resistance continued for days afterward. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest died in their tunnels and pillboxes, fighting to the last as Kuribayashi had ordered. The general himself was never found, his body lost among thousands of Japanese dead. His fate remains unknown, though most historians believe he died in the final days of fighting, probably leading a small counterattack or defending one of the last command posts. American casualties were staggering and shocking. The three Marine divisions suffered 6,821 killed in action or missing and presumed dead. Another 19,217 were wounded. Navy corpsmen and surgeons assigned to Marines added 209 more killed. More than 800 Americans died for every square mile of Iwo Jima's volcanic sand. The casualty rate approached 30%, meaning nearly 1 in 3 Marines who landed on Iwo Jima became a casualty. Some units suffered much higher rates. The 28th Marines, which bore the brunt of fighting for Mount Suribachi and subsequent northern operations, was decimated. The strategic value of Iwo Jima would be debated for decades. The island did serve as an emergency landing field for B-29 bombers, with more than 2,000 emergency landings recorded before war's end. Fighter escorts based on Iwo Jima did accompany bombers to Japan, improving survival rates and bombing effectiveness. But whether these benefits justified the terrible cost remained controversial. Some historians argue Iwo Jima was strategically necessary, that lives saved by emergency landings and fighter escort exceeded lives lost taking the island. Others contend the island could have been bypassed, that its strategic value didn't warrant casualties suffered. What cannot be debated is the courage and sacrifice of Marines who fought there, who advanced across volcanic ash under withering fire, who attacked fortified positions knowing odds of survival were low, who continued fighting despite casualties that would have broken lesser units. The recommendation for Tony Stein's Medal of Honor began with his company commander's initial report of his actions on February 19th. The company commander had witnessed Stein's extraordinary courage firsthand, had seen him standing upright under fire, charging pillboxes, making those 8 trips back to the beach. The recommendation moved up through channels, gathering endorsements at each level. Battalion commander, regimental commander, division commander, each reviewed the recommendation and added their endorsement. The detailed narrative of Stein's actions grew with each level of review, as additional witnesses contributed their observations. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, reviewed the recommendation and approved. Marine Corps Commandant General Alexander Vandergrift, himself a Medal of Honor recipient for actions on Guadalcanal, reviewed and approved. Chief of Naval Operations Fleet Admiral Ernest King, the senior naval officer in the entire U.S. military, reviewed and approved. Stein's Medal of Honor received 15 endorsements, the most of any award in the Iwo Jima campaign. This number reflected both the extraordinary nature of his actions and the number of witnesses who could testify to what they'd seen. The final citation, approved by President Harry Truman, praised Stein's conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It described his personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, making it perhaps the only Medal of Honor citation that explicitly references an unauthorized weapon modification. The citation detailed his rapid covering fire for advancing units, his willingness to expose himself to draw Japanese fire and locate enemy positions, his charges against pillboxes, his 8 trips back to the beach for ammunition while carrying or assisting wounded Marines. Each element was documented and verified by multiple witnesses. Exactly 1 year after his heroic actions, on February 19, 1946, Tony Stein's widow Joan received his Medal of Honor at the Ohio State House in Columbus. Vice Admiral Frederick William Pinoya Jr., commander of the 9th Naval District, tied the medal around her neck in a ceremony attended by Ohio Governor Frank Lauscher and Stein's mother Rose. The 3 of them stood together, united in grief and pride, tears streaming down their faces as they listened to the citation being read. Joan was 24 years old, the same age Tony had been when he died. She wore black, holding the medal that represented her husband's sacrifice, the physical embodiment of courage that had cost her everything. Rose Stein, who'd immigrated from Austria-Hungary seeking a better life for her children, who'd worked and sacrificed to give her son opportunities, stood beside her daughter-in-law mourning the price of those opportunities. Her son had died defending the country that had given his family refuge, had sacrificed himself for American ideals and American lives. The ceremony was dignified and solemn, befitting the sacrifice it honored, but it couldn't fill the void left by Tony's death, couldn't restore what had been lost on that volcanic island 7,000 miles away. After the battle, the 6 Stingers disappeared from historical record. The Marine Corps, institutionally conservative and averse to non-standard equipment, almost certainly destroyed them. Official property records would have no category for unauthorized weapon modifications. Tables of organization and equipment didn't list Stingers. No procurement codes existed for their components. From a bureaucratic perspective, the Stingers were problems. They represented unauthorized modifications of government property. They consumed ammunition at rates that complicated supply planning. They required specialized training that wasn't part of standard curricula. They existed outside the formal structure of military organization. No official documentation exists for the Stinger program because it was never official. The weapons existed in a grey area, approved at battalion level but never sanctioned by higher headquarters. Milan Grevich had authorization from his battalion commander, written approval that protected him from charges of unauthorized modification, but that authorization extended only to building the weapons, not to preserving them after battle. In the immediate aftermath of Iwo Jima, there was brief discussion about mass-producing Stingers for issue to Marine rifle companies. The weapons had proven themselves in combat, had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded any standard light machine gun. Officers who'd witnessed Stinger performance wrote enthusiastic reports recommending wider adoption. But the war ended 6 months after Iwo Jima, and urgent need disappeared with Japan's surrender. The massive military establishment that had prosecuted the war began rapid demobilization. Weapons development programs were cancelled, procurement budgets were slashed. The focus shifted from wartime innovation to peacetime standardization. In this environment, the Stinger had no future. It was a weapon born of wartime necessity, created by individual initiative to solve specific tactical problems. When those problems disappeared with Japan's surrender, so did institutional interest in the solution. The weapons themselves were probably destroyed during general cleanup that followed combat operations. Damaged equipment was collected and disposed of. Non-standard weapons were destroyed to prevent unauthorized distribution. The Stingers, marked by combat use and extensive modification, would have been obvious candidates for destruction. Thus ended the combat career of one of the most innovative infantry weapons of World War II. 6 weapons built in workshops with hand tools, employed in combat for 6 weeks, then destroyed and forgotten by the institution they'd served. Milan Grevich survived the war. He returned to Minnesota, carrying with him the knowledge that his innovation had saved Marine lives, had helped achieve victory in one of history's bloodiest battles. The Stinger's contribution couldn't be quantified precisely. There was no way to know exactly how many Marines survived because Stinger fire suppressed the pillbox that would have killed them. But Grevich knew, as did Marines who'd fought alongside Stinger gunners, that the weapons made a difference. The concentrated firepower they provided created tactical opportunities that conventional weapons couldn't. The suppressive capability they offered gave demolition teams the seconds they needed to close with enemy positions. Grevich never sought recognition for the Stinger, never pushed for official acknowledgement of his role in developing it. He understood the weapon was just one small piece of a much larger story, one innovation among countless others made by Marines who saw problems and fixed them. This humility was characteristic of his generation of combat veterans. They'd done what needed to be done, had served when called, had survived when others hadn't. They came home and rebuilt their lives, carrying memories they rarely discussed, knowledge of horrors they couldn't explain to those who hadn't been there. In later years, as historians began documenting the Stinger story, Grevich would occasionally share his recollections. He spoke matter-of-factly about the weapon's development, describing technical details and tactical employment without drama or embellishment. To him, the Stinger was a practical solution to a tactical problem, not a historic innovation worthy of special recognition. This perspective, while admirable in its modesty, somewhat obscures the significance of what Grevich achieved. Working with hand tools in improvised workshops without engineering support or official sanction, he and John Little created a weapon that dramatically outperformed standard equipment issued by the world's most powerful military. They identified a capability gap, recognized that existing equipment could fill that gap if properly modified, acquired necessary components through unofficial channels, fabricated custom parts, tested and refined their design, trained gunners in proper employment, and deployed weapons into combat. This entire process, from conception to combat use, took approximately 3 months. Modern weapons acquisition programs require years or decades to accomplish similar developments. The bureaucratic process alone, from identifying requirement to fielding solution, typically exceeds the time Grevich spent building 6 functional Stingers. The lessons of the Stinger were both learned and forgotten. Learned in the sense that Marines continued to value innovation, continued to encourage the kind of initiative that Grevich displayed. The Corps maintained its culture of expecting junior leaders to solve problems, to adapt to circumstances, to do whatever was necessary to accomplish the mission. This culture manifested in countless ways throughout subsequent conflicts. In Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, Marines improvised solutions to problems that official channels couldn't address quickly enough. They modified equipment, developed new tactics, created local solutions to local problems. But the lessons were also forgotten in important ways. The institutional military remained uncomfortable with unauthorized modifications, with weapons that existed outside official channels. The bureaucratic imperative toward standardization, while necessary for large-scale logistics, often stifled the kind of innovation that Grevich represented. Modern military regulations governing weapons modifications are strict and comprehensive. Unauthorized modifications are prohibited and punishable. Every weapon must conform to official specifications. This standardization serves important purposes, ensuring reliability, safety, and logistics compatibility across large organizations. But it also prevents the kind of rapid innovation that the Stinger represented. A modern sergeant who attempted what Grevich did, modifying aircraft weapons for infantry use without formal authorization, would face court-martial regardless of how effective the modifications proved in combat. The tension between standardization and innovation remains unresolved. Large military organizations require standardization for logistics, training, and maintenance. But combat effectiveness sometimes demands innovation that official channels can't provide quickly enough. Finding the balance between these competing demands continues to challenge military leadership. In recent years, interest in the Stinger has grown among firearms historians and World War II researchers. The weapon represents a fascinating intersection of innovation, necessity, and combat effectiveness that makes it worthy of study beyond its limited combat use. The Canadian Historical Arms Museum commissioned a fully functional replica, working with firearms expert Paul Shull, for the television show The Weapon Hunter. Building this replica took 3 months and required extensive research to recreate components that Grevich fabricated without any blueprints or documentation. Shull had to reverse engineer the modifications based on photographs, written descriptions, and understanding of original components. The trigger mechanism was particularly challenging, as no detailed documentation existed of Grevich's design. Shull created a mechanism that matched the general description and achieved similar functionality, but whether it precisely replicated Grevich's original design remains unknown. Another replica was built for the Clint Eastwood film Flags of Our Fathers, which depicted the Iwo Jima campaign and the famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi. The scene featuring the Stinger was ultimately cut from the final version of the film, though the replica exists in the film's prop collection. Firearms expert Ian McCullum examined one of these replicas for his Forgotten Weapons series, a YouTube channel dedicated to documenting unusual and historically significant firearms. McCollum's detailed examination, watched by millions of viewers, introduced the Stinger to modern audiences who would otherwise never know such a weapon existed. These replicas and examinations serve important historical purposes. They preserve knowledge of the weapon's design and function. They demonstrate the practical challenges Grevich faced in creating the modifications. They allow modern researchers to understand the weapon's capabilities and limitations in ways that written descriptions alone can't convey. But replicas, no matter how carefully constructed, can't capture everything about the original Stingers. They lack the combat wear, the field repairs, the individual quirks that developed in weapons used under extreme conditions. They can't convey what it felt like to carry that weapon across volcanic ash under fire, to feel it heating in your hands as you poured suppressive fire into enemy positions, to make those desperate runs for ammunition knowing your Marines depended on you. The post-war period saw dramatic changes in infantry weapons that reflected some lessons learned from weapons like the Stinger. The M1919A6 was finally replaced by the M60 machine gun in the late 1950s. The M60 weighed 23 pounds, comparable to the Stinger, and could be effectively employed by a single soldier. The M60's design incorporated lessons from both American and German weapons development during World War II. It used a quick-change barrel system that allowed gunners to replace overheated barrels in seconds, addressing one of the Stinger's fundamental limitations. It achieved cyclic rates of around 500 to 650 rounds per minute, faster than the M1919A6, but slower than the Stinger. Modern machine guns continue this evolution, providing incredible firepower in increasingly portable packages. The M249 Squad automatic weapon weighs just 17 pounds and fires 700 to 1,000 rounds per minute. The M240 machine gun, though heavier at 27 pounds, offers exceptional reliability and sustained fire capability. Yet, none of these modern weapons fire as fast as the Stinger did. Modern military doctrine recognizes that extremely high rates of fire create more problems than they solve. They burn through ammunition too quickly, creating logistics challenges. They accelerate barrel wear, reducing weapon life. They reduce accuracy as recoil and barrel movement accumulate. The Stinger's 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute was only sustainable because of specific tactical circumstances. The 6-week duration of the Iwo Jima campaign meant barrel life was less critical than immediate firepower. The established logistics system meant ammunition could be delivered to the island by ship. The desperate nature of the fighting meant maximizing suppressive effect mattered more than conserving ammunition. In modern sustained operations, these trade-offs would be unacceptable. Modern machine guns balance rate of fire against sustained fire capability, ammunition economy, and barrel life. The result is weapons that fire slower than the Stinger, but can maintain that fire for extended periods without overheating or requiring excessive ammunition resupply. Looking back across 80 years, the Stinger emerges as a symbol of Marine Corps culture at its finest. Initiative, aggression, innovation, mission focus, willingness to work outside normal channels when necessary. These values defined the Marines who built and wielded the Stinger. Tony Stein embodied these values in his Medal of Honor actions, standing upright in enemy fire because the mission required it, running across open ground 8 times because his weapon needed feeding, carrying wounded Marines to safety because they were his brothers, returning from the hospital ship to rejoin his unit because he couldn't abandon them. These weren't the actions of a man following orders or adhering to regulations. These were the actions of a man who understood what needed to be done and did it regardless of personal risk. The Stinger enabled his effectiveness, but his courage created the opportunity for the weapon to prove its worth. Milan Grevich embodied these same values in creating the weapon, seeing a problem that cost Marine lives, identifying a solution that regulations didn't authorize, building it anyway because saving lives mattered more than following procedures, training others in its use because shared knowledge multiplied impact. Grevich never sought recognition for the Stinger, never pushed for official acknowledgement of his role in developing it. To him, the weapon was simply what needed to be done, one Marine's contribution to helping other Marines survive and accomplish their mission. This humility, characteristic of his generation, perhaps obscures the significance of his achievement, but it also reflects values that made the achievement possible. Grevich didn't build the Stinger for recognition or reward. He built it because Marines were dying for lack of adequate fire support, and he could do something about it. The Stinger never became official. It never appeared in weapons manuals or equipment tables. It never received a formal designation or procurement budget. No modern military uses weapons based on Stinger design. No institutional memory preserves detailed knowledge of how they were built or employed. But for 6 brief weeks on the bloodiest beach in Marine Corps history, the Stinger gave Marines fighting and dying on volcanic rock a weapon that helped them survive, helped them win, helped them accomplish a mission that cost more American lives than any other battle in the Pacific War. That contribution can't be measured in official documentation or procurement records. It can only be measured in the Marines who came home because Tony Stein's Stinger suppressed the pillbox that would have killed them, because Milan Grevich built a weapon when official weapons were inadequate, because initiative and innovation mattered more than regulations and procedures. 6 improvised weapons, 6 weeks of combat, 1 Medal of Honor, and countless Marines who lived because someone dared to build something better. The story of the Stinger reminds us that wars are won by those who solve problems rather than those who follow rules, by those who innovate rather than those who wait for permission, by those who take risks rather than those who play it safe. These lessons remain relevant today, as modern militaries struggle to balance standardization against innovation, official process against individual initiative, institutional caution against tactical necessity. The tension between these competing demands will never be fully resolved, but the Stinger story suggests that success requires preserving space for both. The greatest military organizations are those that can maintain rigorous standards while still empowering individuals to solve problems creatively. They are organizations that value initiative even when it challenges established procedures, that reward innovation even when it exists outside official channels, that trust their people to do what needs to be done, even when regulations might suggest otherwise. The Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, who wielded improvised weapons against an enemy determined to kill them all, who continued advancing when survival instincts screamed to take cover, embodied these principles. They represent the best of American military tradition, the conviction that individual initiative and collective purpose can overcome any obstacle. Tony Stein died on March 1, 1945. But his legacy endures in every Marine who refuses to accept that the official solution is the only solution. In every warrior who understands that sometimes the mission requires tools that don't exist yet, in every leader who trusts their people to innovate when innovation is needed. Milan Grevich lived into old age, carrying memories of volcanic, beaches and improvised weapons, of friends lost and battles won, of a time when necessity demanded innovation and courage enabled extraordinary achievement. His contribution, though never officially recognized by the institution he served, helped save lives and win battles. The Stinger itself is gone, destroyed decades ago by an institution uncomfortable with weapons that existed outside official channels. But what the Stinger represented endures in military culture, in the understanding that sometimes the best solution is the one you build yourself, that regulations exist to serve the mission rather than the mission serving regulations, that saving lives and accomplishing objectives matters more than bureaucratic comfort. This is the Stinger's true legacy, not the weapon itself but what it represented, not the technical specifications but the values that created it, not the unauthorized modification but the authorized courage to do what needed to be done regardless of regulations. In the end, perhaps that's the most fitting tribute to both the weapon and the warriors who wielded it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.